This is the new MacBook Neo, Apple's newest and most affordable laptop. You can pick one up for just $599 US. And when you think about the fact that you're getting a display and a keyboard built in, this is actually the cheapest Apple computer you can buy. As soon as Apple announced it, my first thought was, can you edit 4K video on this thing? Because if you can, this could be a really interesting travel laptop. It's small, it's light, and it even comes in 4 different colors. So I decided to pick one up and try it out. Hey guys, what's up? My name is Serge, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today, I'm testing the performance of this brand new MacBook Neo in Final Cut Pro. Just like always, no synthetic benchmarks, just real-world editing performance, the stuff that really matters. Before we get into the testing, let's take a quick look at the specs of this machine. The biggest thing that jumps out right away is that the MacBook Neo does not come with one of Apple's M-series chips. Instead, it uses Apple's A18 Pro chip, the same chip found in iPhone 16 Pro. This is actually the first Mac ever powered by an iPhone chip. The A18 Pro features a 6-core CPU with 2 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, a 5-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine. It also comes with just 8 GB of unified memory. In terms of upgrades, your options are pretty limited. You can step up to a larger 512GB SSD, the base model includes a 256GB, and you can add Touch ID. Those are basically the only configuration choices available. And I know, on paper, these specs don't sound very impressive, but specs aren't everything. I'm not expecting this MacBook to compete with a MacBook Pro or a Mac Studio. What I really want to find out is whether it's good enough to be a practical travel editing laptop. The project I'm going to use for this test is actually one of my previous YouTube videos, the one where I set up an M5 MacBook Pro. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. In the main timeline, I have a 4K multicam clip shot in Panasonic Vlog with a Rec 709 LED applied to it. Connected to the timeline, there's also a few B-roll clips, some screen recordings, title presets, effects, and a few graphic animations. So, nothing too extreme, but definitely more than just a basic edit. As always, background rendering is turned off, all render files have been deleted, and the viewer is set to better performance. First thing I always like to test is timeline performance, just how smooth everything feels and whether there's any issues navigating around the timeline. For the most part, this was actually pretty good. Skimming felt smooth and responsive with no noticeable lag. I could move the skimmer, hit play, and the playback would start almost instantly. There was a pretty significant delay when generating waveforms while zooming in and out, but that doesn't really affect performance. Playback did suffer a bit though. The first thing I noticed was that the scrolling timeline did start to fall behind slightly and skip. Anytime I tried to play back a clip for more than a few seconds, Final Cut Pro would begin dropping frames, especially in areas with multiple layers. But remember, this is a fairly heavy, completely unrendered timeline. Rendering might help out quite a bit in this case. We'll find out in a bit. The next test I like to do is play back the entire video. Most machines I've tested have no issues playing back short sections of timelines. But when you put a sustained load on the computer, like playing a full 13-minute unrendered project, this is where cheaper machines usually start to show their weaknesses. Playback started off smooth, but at around the 24-second mark, the scrolling timeline began to lag slightly. Playback itself stayed fairly smooth. About 2.5 minutes into the project, in a section with multiple layers of 4K video, the scrolling timeline really started falling behind, and Final Cut Pro began skipping frames. As soon as the timeline returned to a single layer, everything went back to normal. Playback actually remained surprisingly smooth for most of the video, even with my animated title cards. I did notice the occasional small stutter during transitions. Nothing major, just a few dropped frames. It wasn't until the 10-minute mark that playback really started to fall apart, especially in heavier sections with stacked layers and animations. But again, once the timeline went back to a single layer, performance recovered. It wasn't perfect, but honestly, I'm really impressed with how the MacBook Neo handled this test. I expected it to struggle much earlier in the project. Instead, it held up fairly well almost all the way to the end, which is pretty impressive for a computer with specs this modest. Next, before doing any rendering, I wanted to try exporting this 13-minute project using the Apple device's 4K preset. This is my go-to setting for exporting YouTube videos. It retains great quality, file sizes stay very reasonable, and in my experience, YouTube seems to process these files way faster than most other codecs. The A18 Pro MacBook Neo did not export this project very quickly. It took almost 45 minutes to export a 13-minute timeline. Definitely not ideal. Just for reference, exporting this exact same project on my M4 Pro Mac Mini takes about 8 minutes. Even my 4-year-old M1 Pro MacBook Pro finished this export roughly 3 times faster, coming in at around 15 minutes. So yeah, this is probably fine if you're using the Neo to edit shorter videos or reels for Instagram, but for longer form content, this is where things start to feel a bit limiting. Maybe rendering this timeline first will help. So the next test I performed was rendering this 13-minute timeline using the Apple ProRes 422 codec. Once again, just for reference, my M4 Pro Mac Mini can render the same project in a little over 6 minutes. My M1 Pro MacBook Pro does it in about 12 minutes. So can the MacBook Neo come anywhere close to that? Rendering this timeline took about 14.5 minutes. Not terrible, but definitely not great either. Playback after rendering though was buttery smooth. Once everything was rendered, the timeline felt completely different. Skimming was instant, playback was perfectly clean, and even heavier sections with multiple layers played back without any drop frames. So, while the export times on this machine are definitely on the slow side, the actual editing performance becomes much more usable if you're willing to render first. Next, I wanted to see if rendering would make any difference to the export speed. So I exported the same 13-minute project again, this time fully rendered, using the Apple device's 4K preset. In previous tests, rendering made a huge difference on Intel Macs, but it didn't seem to help much on M-series machines. My first export attempt didn't go very well. About 2 minutes in, the system ran out of application memory. That's one of the downsides of having limited unified memory and a small internal drive. After clearing a few files, I tried again. The second attempt was successful, but unfortunately, rendering the timeline didn't improve export performance. Once again, exporting my 13-minute project took about 45 minutes. So, after spending some time editing on the new MacBook Neo, where does this machine actually fit in? I definitely wouldn't recommend this as your main editing computer, especially if you're always working on longer projects or heavier timelines. Export times are slow, memory can become a limitation, and overall performance just isn't on the same level as Apple M-series Macs. But it doesn't mean this laptop is useless for video editing. If you're traveling, working on shorter videos, organizing footage, or just putting together rough cuts on the go, the MacBook Neo can actually handle that surprisingly well. Timeline performance, especially once rendered, is very usable. And for basic editing tasks, it's honestly more capable than I expected. You just need to be patient. So, as a lightweight travel editing laptop, or maybe a secondary machine to complement a more powerful desktop setup, I think the MacBook Neo makes a bit more sense. It's not perfect, it has clear limitations, but for the price, and considering it's powered by what is essentially an iPhone chip, it's pretty impressive what this little machine can do. So now I'm curious, what do you think? Would you ever consider using something like the MacBook Neo for video editing? Or is it just pushing things a little too far? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this real-world performance test, make sure you subscribe. I've got a lot more Mac and Final Cut Pro content coming soon. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.